Here's the introduction for your YouTube video story. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, and yet there was an eerie silence hanging in the air. It wasn't just another trial. This one had the entire city talking. People whispered among themselves, glancing at the man in uniform standing at the front of the room. Officer Mark Reynolds, a name that once commanded respect, a name that made criminals nervous. But today, he wasn't here as the hero. He wasn't here as the law. Today, he was the accused. Mark stood tall, his police badge still pinned to his chest, as if he refused to believe that any of this was real. He had walked into courtrooms many times before, always on the other side, always the one bringing criminals to justice. He never imagined he would be the one facing the judge. In his mind, that badge made him untouchable. He had power, influence, connections. But all of that had started to unravel the moment he crossed paths with her asterisk. Across the room, standing with an air of quiet confidence, was the woman who had brought him here. Attorney Jessica Carter. She wasn't afraid of Mark. Unlike the others, she didn't flinch under his stare. She had spent years fighting for people who had no voice, taking on cases that others avoided. And this one was personal. Jessica had seen officers like Mark before. Men who thought the law was something they could twist in their favor. Men who used their power to intimidate, to manipulate, to silence those who stood against them. But she wasn't the type to be intimidated. She had uncovered something that could finally expose the truth about Mark Reynolds. And she wasn't going to back down. As the judge entered the room, the tension became almost unbearable. Mark clenched his jaw, keeping his expression blank, but inside he was seething. How had it come to this? He had done things he thought would never come back to haunt him. And yet, here he was. Jessica had pulled every thread, followed every lead, and now everything he had built was crumbling right in front of him. The people in the courtroom weren't just here to watch a trial. They were here to see if justice would finally be served. Some of them had stories about Mark, stories they were too afraid to tell before. But now, with Jessica leading the charge, they finally had hope. The judge's gavel hit the desk. "We will now begin." The voice echoed through the room. Mark's fingers twitched. He could still get out of this. He always did. He had gotten away with so much before. Why should today be any different? But then Jessica turned to face him. And for the first time, something in Harry's made him feel uneasy. She knew something he didn't. And that's when it hit him. He had made a mistake. A mistake that would cost him everything. But what was it? And how had she found out? Stay with us as we uncover the shocking truth in this story of power, corruption, and one woman's fight for justice. The courtroom air felt heavier now. Mark could hear the faint rustle of papers, the occasional cough from the audience, but mostly he felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. He had been in plenty of courtrooms before, seen plenty of trials. But never like this. Never with him standing on this side of things. He kept his face blank, refusing to let even a flicker of emotion show. But deep inside, something unsettling was creeping in. He wasn't in control this time. Jessica stood firm, her presence steady, unfazed by the man who once walked around like he owned the city. She had spent months preparing for this, knowing how careful she had to be. A case like this, against someone like Mark, wasn't easy. She had seen others try and fail. She had seen how the system had protected him time and time again. But she had done what no one else had. She had found the crack in his armor. Mark had built his career on being untouchable. He knew the right people, had the right friends in high places. He had played the game well, always staying just out of reach of real consequences. A complaint here, an accusation there, none of it ever stuck. Witnesses backed out. Evidence went missing. People were too scared to come forward. But this time, something was different. Jessica had found someone who wasn't afraid. Someone who had nothing left to lose. And that changed everything. Her client sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly together, eyes locked on the man who had once held so much power over their life. It had taken everything in them to step forward, to tell the truth, knowing how dangerous it was to go up against someone like Mark. But Jessica had given them something Mark never could: hope. Mark's lawyer shifted beside him, leaning in. "Just keep your mouth shut and let me handle this," he muttered under his breath. Mark didn't respond. He had never been one to sit back and let others fight his battles for him. He was used to being the one calling the shots, making the rules. Now all he could do was watch as the case against him started to unfold. Jessica took a deep breath before stepping forward. She knew how much was at stake. She also knew how much Mark had to lose. And that was what made him dangerous. He wasn't the type to go down without a fight. "Officer Reynolds," she began, her voice steady, "would you say that your record as a police officer has been spotless?" Mark tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I've done my job the way I was trained to do it." Jessica nodded, unfazed. "And in doing your job, have you ever bent the rules? Crossed the line?" Mark's lawyer immediately objected. Leading question. The judge barely looked up, sustained. Jessica expected that. She took a step back, rewarding her approach. "Let's talk about a particular case, then. One that you were involved in about 6 months ago." Mark's jaw tightened slightly. Jessica turned and walked toward the evidence table, picking up a folder. She opened it, flipping through the pages before holding up a document. "Do you recognize this?" Mark didn't look at it right away. He already knew what it was, and he knew exactly what she was trying to do. Jessica continued, "This is a report you filed. A report that conveniently left out some very important details. Would you like me to remind you what those details are?" Mark's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "Objection. If Miss Carter has something relevant, she should present it properly rather than making vague accusations." Jessica turned to the judge. "I'm more than happy to clarify." The judge gestured for her to proceed. Jessica placed the document down on the table in front of her. "This report was filed after an arrest you made. The suspect in question was charged, but something about the details didn't add up. You stated that there was clear evidence that everything was by the book, but witnesses tell a very different story." Mark's fingers curled slightly at his sides. Jessica didn't stop. "You see, Officer Reynolds, people have a tendency to talk when they finally feel safe. And right now, a lot of people are ready to talk." For the first time, Mark felt a crack in the foundation he had carefully built. He wasn't sure what she knew, but he could feel the walls closing in. The people in the courtroom sat frozen, their eyes bouncing between Jessica and Mark, waiting for what would come next. Jessica glanced toward her client in the front row. A silent reassurance passed between them before she turned back to Mark. "Would you like to explain why so many of your past cases have inconsistencies?" Mark stayed silent. Jessica let the question hang in the air for a moment before adding, "Or should I?" The room was completely still, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone. Mark felt the stares, the anticipation, the expectation that he was supposed to have an answer. But for the first time in his career, he didn't. And that was when he realized Jessica Carter wasn't like the others. She wasn't afraid to push, to dig deeper, to go after the truth no matter how many roadblocks were in her way. And right now she was staring straight through him. Mark had walked into this courtroom thinking this was just another obstacle, Another case he could maneuver his way out of. But something told him this time was different. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next. Mark could feel the sweat forming at the back of his neck, but he refused to let it show. His grip on the edge of the defense table tightened slightly as Jessica's words echoed through the silent courtroom. He knew how this game worked. He had played it for years, bending the rules just enough to keep himself safe while making sure no one could ever touch him. But now, for the first time, someone was standing in front of him who wasn't willing to back down. Jessica watched him carefully, studying every small movement. She had dealt with men like Mark before, men who thought they could manipulate their way out of anything. But this wasn't just about proving a point. This was about exposing the truth, about showing the people in this room that Mark Reynolds wasn't the man they thought he was. Mark's lawyer cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Miss Carter, unless you have something concrete to present, we're going in circles." Jessica gave a small smile. "You're right. Let's be more specific, then." She turned back to the evidence table, pulling out another document. "On the night of the incident, your report stated that the suspect resisted arrest, that they attempted to flee. That force was necessary to contain the situation." She paused, looking up at him. "But here's the problem, Officer Reynolds. The suspect says otherwise. And we have witnesses who support their story." Mark barely blinked. "People lie." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "That's true. But surveillance cameras don't." For the first time, a flicker of something passed through Mark's expression. It was brief, barely there, but Jessica caught it. She turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, at this time, we'd like to present new evidence." Mark's lawyer shot up from his seat. "Objection. This evidence was not disclosed prior to today's hearing." Jessica remained calm. "It was obtained legally, and it directly contradicts the defendant's report. The prosecution has every right to present it." The judge sighed, adjusting his glasses as he glanced between them. After a pause, he nodded. "Proceed." Jessica motioned toward the bailiff, who walked over to set up the courtroom monitor. The tension in the room thickened. People in the audience leaned forward, curiosity and anticipation hanging in the air. Mark remained still, but inside, his mind was racing. He had been careful. He had made sure there was nothing that could be traced back to him. But now the uncertainty clawed at the edges of his confidence. The screen flickered to life, and grainy security footage appeared. The angle was from across the street, not directly at the scene, but it was clear enough to see what was happening. The suspect, Mark's supposed resisting suspect, was already on the ground, hands behind their back, not moving. And yet, Mark was still towering over them, his posture aggressive. A murmur spread through the audience. Jessica let the video play for a few more seconds before she paused it. "This doesn't look like someone resisting, does it?" Her voice was steady, but the weight behind her words was sharp. Mark's lawyer quickly stood again. "Your Honor, this video doesn't prove anything. The angle is unclear. It doesn't show the moments before the suspect was detained." Jessica turned, holding her ground. "That's right, which is why we have more." Another video loaded. This time, the angle was closer, taken from a nearby storefront camera. And this time, the details were undeniable. The suspect had already surrendered. They weren't moving. Yet Mark's actions went beyond standard procedure. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Mark's jaw clenched. He could feel the shift happening, the slow but inevitable unraveling of his control. He had walked into this trial assuming it would be another formality, another obstacle he could brush past. But this was different. Jessica let the moment settle before she spoke again. "Officer Reynolds, do you still stand by your report?" Mark didn't respond. Jessica stepped forward. Do you still claim that this suspect was resisting? His lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgently, but Mark didn't hear a word of it. His eyes were locked on the screen, on the frozen image that now seemed bigger than life. The weight of it pressed down on him in a way he had never experienced before. Jessica glanced toward her client, seeing the way they gripped the arms of their chair. This wasn't just a case to them. This was their life, their chance to finally be heard. And in this moment, Jessica knew they were closer than ever to getting justice. But she also knew this wasn't over. Mark Reynolds wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly. He had spent too many years building his reputation, too many years making sure he had power over people like her. If he was going to lose, he wouldn't let it happen without a fight. And that was the dangerous part. Because men like Mark didn't just accept defeat. They found ways to turn the tables, even when it seemed impossible. And Jessica knew that whatever came next would be the most dangerous part of all. The silence in the courtroom stretched thick and suffocating. Mark's breathing was steady, but his heart pounded in his chest. He had been in difficult situations before, but nothing like this. Nothing where the weight of an entire room shifted against him in real time. He could feel it. The witness's presence in the courtroom changed everything. The person on the stand shifted uncomfortably, their fingers gripping the edge of the wooden seat as they avoided Mark's gaze. Jessica watched them carefully, giving them a moment before speaking. Can you state your name for the record? A brief hesitation, then a quiet voice. Daniel Carter. A ripple of whispers moved through the room. Jessica didn't react, but she could feel the energy shift. This wasn't just any witness. This was someone who had been close to Mark, someone no one had expected to testify. Mark's jaw tightened. He had worked with Daniel, had trusted him to keep quiet. Jessica continued, her voice calm but firm. Daniel, you were there the night of the incident, correct? Daniel swallowed hard. Yes. Mark's lawyer stood. Your Honor, this witness has a clear conflict of interest. The prosecution cannot present him as an objective source. Jessica cut in smoothly. The defense can question his credibility all they want. But what matters is the truth. And Daniel was there. The judge looked at Daniel. You may proceed. Jessica nodded toward him. Tell the court what you saw that night. Daniel hesitated again, his hands tightening into fists on his lap. His gaze flickered toward Mark for a fraction of a second before he looked down. It wasn't how Mark said it happened. He admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Jessica didn't rush him. She had seen this before, witnesses caught between fear and conscience. What do you mean? She asked gently. Daniel exhaled slowly. The suspect didn't resist, he said, his voice stronger this time. They were already on the ground. They weren't fighting back. Mark, he just kept going. Mark's lawyer slammed his hand on the table. Objection. This is speculation. Jessica turned sharply. Speculation. Or an eyewitness account from someone who was standing right there. The judge raised a hand, signaling for order. Let the witness continue. Daniel's eyes darted around the room. I didn't say anything before because I was scared, he admitted. Mark, he has a way of making people stay in line. And I thought if I just kept my head down, it would blow over. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling now. But then I saw the video, and I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Mark's fingers curled into fists. He had underestimated Daniel. He had assumed loyalty would win over guilt. Jessica took a step closer. Daniel, did Officer Reynolds instruct you to alter your report that night? A long pause. Then finally, Daniel nodded. Yes. He told me to leave out what really happened. A shocked murmur ran through the room. Jessica kept her expression steady. And did you? Daniel's shoulders slumped. I did. I changed my statement to match his, because I knew what would happen if I didn't. Mark's lawyer stood again. Your Honor, this is a clear attempt to discredit my client without concrete proof. This witness is only speaking up now under pressure. Jessica turned toward him, unshaken. Or maybe he's speaking up now because he finally has the courage to tell the truth. Mark could feel control slipping through his fingers. He had always been able to control the narrative, to keep people in check. But now, one of his own had turned against him. And worse, Jessica had known exactly how to make it happen. But then, just as Jessica was about to push forward, something unexpected happened. A commotion erupted near the back of the courtroom. The doors burst open, and another figure stepped inside. Jessica's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. Mark turned, and for the first time, real panic flickered across his face. Because the person standing in the doorway wasn't just another witness. It was someone who could destroy everything. The room fell into stunned silence as all eyes turned toward the doorway. The figure standing there was someone no one had expected, someone who shouldn't have been there at all. A woman stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she moved with quiet confidence. Mark's face went pale. For the first time since this trial started, he looked genuinely rattled. Jessica, on the other hand, didn't even blink. She had been waiting for this moment. She had played every move carefully, knowing exactly how to push Mark to the edge. And now, here it was, the final piece of the puzzle. The judge leaned forward, frowning. And who is this? Jessica turned to face the courtroom. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce someone with critical information regarding this case. Mark's lawyer shot up from his seat. Your Honor, this is completely out of order. The prosecution is ambushing us with a witness we haven't had the chance to review. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. I will allow it. But this better be relevant, Miss Carter. Jessica nodded and gestured toward the woman. Please state your name for the record. The woman's gaze didn't waver as she stepped forward. Samantha Hayes. A murmur rippled through the room. People exchanged confused glances, whispering among themselves. But Mark, he didn't move. He just sat there, frozen, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. Jessica turned back to Samantha. Miss Hayes, can you tell the court why you're here today? Samantha took a deep breath, then looked directly at Mark. Because he thought he could erase me. The words sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Jessica saw the flicker of recognition in Mark's eyes, the moment he realized just how bad this was going to get. Samantha stepped closer to the stand. I used to work with Officer Reynolds. Years ago, I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to. I tried to report it, but before I could, I was threatened. Harassed. My career was destroyed. She turned to the judge. I left the state because I was afraid, but I never forgot. And when I saw this case, when I saw what he did again, I knew I had to come back. Mark's lawyer was already flipping through his notes, scrambling for a response. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The witness has no connection to the current case. Jessica smiled, just barely. Actually, it's extremely relevant. Because what happened to Samantha Hayes shows a pattern. A pattern of abuse, of cover-ups, of silencing anyone who dared to stand up against him. Samantha's voice grew stronger, and I'm not the only one. Mark's fingers curled around the edge of the table, knuckles turning white. He knew what was coming next. Jessica reached into her folder and pulled out another document. Your Honor, I have statements from multiple individuals who have come forward since this case began. People who have been afraid to speak up for years, but no. She turned toward Mark, her voice sharp. Now they aren't afraid anymore. Mark's lawyer stood so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. Your Honor, I move to dismiss this entire testimony. None of this proves anything about the case at hand. The judge didn't even look at him. His gaze was locked on Mark. Officer Reynolds, he said, his voice quiet but firm, do you have anything to say? Mark's mouth opened, but no words came out. Jessica let the silence stretch. Mark had spent years believing he was untouchable, that his badge made him immune to consequences. But now, under the weight of all the eyes in the courtroom, under the weight of the truth, he wasn't untouchable anymore. Finally, Mark let out a slow breath. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, he looked small, defeated. Jessica didn't need to hear him speak to know they had won. But then, just when it seemed like everything was over, Mark did something no one expected. He turned, looked directly at Samantha, and smirked. Jessica's stomach dropped. Mark leaned forward, just slightly, and said, "You think this ends here?" A chill ran down Jessica's spine. Because in that moment, she realized something. This wasn't just about Mark Reynolds. This was bigger. And the fight was far from over. Jessica felt the weight of Mark's words settle over the courtroom like a storm cloud. The smirk on his face, that quiet, knowing arrogance, it sent a shiver through her. Even in the face of undeniable truth, he still believed he had some kind of control. But that was the thing about people like Mark. They didn't realize when they had already lost. Samantha's expression didn't change, but Jessica could see her fingers curl into fists at her sides. She wasn't scared anymore. Not of him. Not of the past. And certainly not of whatever threat he was trying to make. The judge cleared his throat, bringing the attention back to the bench. Officer Reynolds, I would advise you to choose your next words carefully, he said, his voice steady. Because as of this moment, your future is no longer in your hands. Mark's jaw tightened. Jessica stepped forward, keeping her voice calm but firm. Your Honor, in light of the testimonies, the evidence, and the pattern of behavior clearly established, the prosecution formally requests that Mark Reynolds be remanded without bail pending further investigation into additional allegations. Mark's lawyer immediately stood. Your Honor, my client has rights. These so-called new allegations are unproven, and we have yet to review them. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. His gaze shifted to Mark, who sat stiffly, his usual bravado starting to crack under the weight of the moment. The court finds that there is sufficient cause to proceed. Officer Reynolds, you are hereby remanded into custody until further proceedings. Bail is denied. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood echoed through the room, final and absolute. For the first time, real fear flickered in Mark's eyes. It was subtle, just a flash, but Jessica saw it. He was beginning to understand. The power he had relied on for so long, the power to intimidate, to manipulate, to walk away untouched, was gone. There was no easy exit this time. 2 officers stepped forward, moving to cuff him. Mark stiffened, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. When the cold metal of the cuffs snapped around his wrists, the smirk disappeared entirely. Jessica let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to Samantha, who was watching everything unfold with quiet intensity. Their eyes met, and for the first time since she had walked through those courtroom doors, Samantha's shoulders eased. It was over. Or at least this part was. As Mark was led out of the courtroom, the weight of everything settled over Jessica. Justice wasn't always neat. It wasn't always wrapped up in a single verdict or a dramatic moment in court. It was a battle, sometimes long, sometimes exhausting, but worth every second. Because people like Mark thrived in the shadows. And today, he had finally been dragged into the light. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. Lighter. Reporters were already gathering, cameras flashing, voices calling out for comments. But Jessica wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about the people who had come forward. The ones who had been afraid for so long. The ones who had thought no one would ever believe them. Daniel stood a few feet away, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his expression unreadable. But when he caught Jessica's gaze, he gave a small nod. A silent thank you. Samantha, standing next to him, let out a slow breath. "It's not over, is it?" she asked quietly. Jessica shook her head. Not completely. There are still more people to hold accountable. More voices that need to be heard. Samantha looked down for a moment, then met Jessica's gaze again. Then let's make sure they are. A small smile tugged at the corner of Jessica's lips. For so long, Mark Reynolds had believed his badge made him untouchable. He had thought he could manipulate the truth, bury the past, silence the people who dared to stand against him. But in the end, it hadn't been power or intimidation that brought him down. It had been the truth, and the people willing to stand up for it. As Jessica walked away from the courthouse, she knew the fight wasn't over. But today, they had won a battle, and that was enough to keep going.